do you differentiate the energy that comes in? So if it's one of your guides or another dimensional being, or how can you tell that it's Christ consciousness coming in, for example?
That's a really good question. So, how I can personally tell that it's Christ consciousness coming in is there's a peace and a relaxation. So, even though there's a strong intensity within the energies that are being received, Christ consciousness feels very expansive and kind of like this unconditional love is called many things. We call many things that. Unconditional love has this ability to allow all to be wherever they are at in their own journey, in their own phase of consciousness, and yet still be able to have that higher impulse, have that higher, let's just call it desire or push for consciousness, but in a way where it's not overriding a person's free will. So there's this expansive energy. Basically, what I just said, if it was an equation, it would be like that impulse towards consciousness, because the more a being goes towards consciousness, the less you think a collective would be in unconscious suffering, right? There's conscious suffering and then there's unconscious suffering. Conscious suffering is inevitable, but that's where alchemy has the possibility for transmutation. Unconscious suffering is just samsara. We're repeating things and we're calling it fate, and we're really not coming from the higher centers, from our higher knowing. We're not coming from our godhood. So with Christ consciousness, there's this impulse. It's not like, oh, I don't have any agenda for you at all. You can be whatever you want. No, the impulse is towards consciousness, because with more consciousness, with more connection or remembering of our true nature, there will hopefully be less unconscious suffering. So you have this impulse towards consciousness, towards unity, but you also have this complete, absolute, free will ability to hold that space while still understanding that other people it's not demanding. They don't need to be at that level. So those two equal this kind of like very expansive consciousness that emanates from the heart center. It also emanates from the third eye region as well. But it's this expansive state of peace, but a peace that has a will still. So that's where we come in and we start inserting our will, which at that point, when you've already united, when you're already operating from unity consciousness, there's no more dichotomy. There's no more like, well, I'm a human and I have free will, and then there's this higher power and it has a free will. Those have been reconciled already. So there's no longer a higher power saying like you need to be this way or whatever, because you already have merged, not fully, but you've already merged. You've awakened enough to have your will align. It's kind of like back to the matcha thing. It's like, that's funny that we were talking about that in the beginning, because it's like you get to a point of health where you go, well, I don't want to drink, let's say, coffee. Let's pretend coffee's horrible. Okay, it's not, but let's just pretend it's horrible. When the being goes, for health, I don't resonate with coffee anymore. That would almost be like a microcosm example of how the individual's will has aligned with the higher power or the divine will. It's not by a force, it's by the person already aligning into that space so that they're one. And so because of that, Christ consciousness is really this ability to allow others their own journey while also striving towards the impulse of unity consciousness. So it's neither too passive and it's neither too aggressive, or it's neither too overactive and it's neither too passive.
Oh, I love your description of that. Yeah. And I figured I should ask you that so that we can touch on kind of like the simplicity of coffee and alcohol, but like there's a much deeper system going on under there, which is suffering and feeding into kind of a void. How do you even perceive that void that people who face addiction can experience, or, anything like that? Like, what is that impulse to almost like self-harm or to pacify? What do you think that is? Because I love when you talk about, pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice kind of thing. But where do you think that kind of density is? And why is it in existence? And how does it relate to our human experience, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. So it's acting as a buffer between us and higher states of consciousness at a certain point. When we wake up, and I'm never going to lose sleep if someone drinks. You know what I mean? Like, as long as a person's not harming children or pets or animals, like, I don't care, because you really get into a space at a certain point of the journey where I'm not saying I'm free of judgment,
Mm-hmm.
but you get to a space where you can be very discerning of what needs judgment and what doesn't. So if somebody drinks, I don't care.
Yeah.
But there is naturally, just as we were talking about natural degrees going into what we would call health, this abstract concept of whatever that person defines as health. With drinking, there is a certain level of putting the body through things that if it had to say, if you gave the body a voice, it would say, I really don't want to drink that. Please don't make me drink that. You're putting that in my body. I don't want to make anyone feel bad because I don't care.
Oh, well, you can talk directly to me because this is what I'm navigating right now. I still drink like red wine and things, but I have this exact experience. Like my body's like, please don't. And then I still drink it. And that's okay. I'm not even judging myself, but just curious on your perspective of this. Totally. So, yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to drinking, it's one of those things where when we step into naturally, this is just naturally going to happen. When we step into more degrees of health, there are things that we will no longer resonate with.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that'll be like, oh, like you just peel something off. Sometimes it'll be harder. I've had stages where I'm like, wow, I'm completely over that. I had to get a massive infection to get over smoking my own rolled tobacco. And I tried everything to convince my higher self that I could do both. I was like, no, look, I got bamboo paper. It's organic. And then I was like, look, this is tobacco from Europe. They don't spray the same stuff there. Like I wanted to keep that comfort, that security blanket, probably the most out of perhaps all of them along my journey. And I had like this massive infection on my hand. Could write a book about it, but I'm not going there. And so I had to like not smoke for 6 weeks, basically. So I couldn't roll my own things and go out and look at the moon at night like I love to. But at that point, it wasn't even just at night. It was like, honestly, like every 45 minutes. So it was bad. And so I couldn't for 6 weeks. And then finally, I made up that I could go back to doing it. So I went back and I rolled one and I smoked my little hand rolled tobacco at night, and my lungs burned.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went, you know what? Whether you want to look at it this way, whether you want to call it grace or not, you have this grace of this window that you were forced into. And now you could take it, or you could train your lungs to like this again. But you didn't really like it in the first place. And I knew that after the 6 weeks. So I went, you know what? I'm just going to take this window of grace, because the reason I call it grace is I wasn't going to stop on my own. So
Mm-hmm. I've been right there too with tobacco. There's something so wonderful about smoking something once in a while. But yeah, I think my journey was similar, but I had to get under to like, what's triggering me to roll the next one? Is there an anxiety that I'm covering? And I think it leads us into a conversation too about the nature of suffering as part of the human experience. And I mean, do you think that we ever really get through that? Or is it something that we can shift our perspective around to understand pain as something that's an opportunity every time that it arises to get us closer and closer to an essential peace?
yes, because that's the way that this universe is designed. So I saw this one meme one time that pretty much summed it up. It was like, you got to go inside, like, you got to pass the dragon, or you got to go in the cave to go get the gold, something like that. And that's how this universe was set up. So there can be different universes that operate under different laws, and that's cool. The hardware of our brain is designed to not even conceptualize other universes. That's why we go like, oh, there's nothing after light. It's like, that's not very humble, you humble people. It's just because we cannot conceive, we're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Why would we be able, then we can't commit to the universe we're in if we can conceive of all these things. So in this universe, it is set up to be light, and light casts a shadow. So the deeper into this universe you go, the darker and denser the shadow goes, because the thicker the polarity, the split happens between that light. And so that is also, go figure, what I'm also calling addiction. The deeper you go into this reality. And that's why another way, I told this to the people who I just had on a retreat that week, and they're like, whoa, I was like, samsara is just another word for addiction. Yeah. Like we're all addicted. And that doesn't mean that the physical body it doesn't mean we can be in harmony with this experience. There's always an exalted way to express any energy. So I'm not saying that in this case. All I'm saying is that when there's unconsciousness, so when a being is not conscious and then they're deep in polarity, that's a basic math equation for, a lot of suffering. But the other side of that coin, the one that you were talking about, is, yeah, there's effing art. Like that, the beauty of this reality is that, the darker the challenge, the greater the reward is the potential. And so with that, that's in and of itself an alchemy. And that is the blessing, and that is the curse of this reality.
I love how you just phrased that, like that light casts a shadow. Just that simple thing just triggered something in me that was like, yes, absolutely. And it's reminding me of this quote that I was seeing the other day, like pain needs somewhere to live beyond the body. So getting it out into writing, or as you were saying, poetry, like moving your pain through into art. Absolutely. I love that way, that lens of thinking. So I know you talk a lot about mysticism as well. So I'm curious to understand what your perception is of mysticism. Does it differentiate from like spirituality, or like how does it differentiate from religion, spirituality, all these other kind of dimensions? And what does mysticism even mean to you or look like?
That's a great question. Mysticism to me looks like direct experience. So everything before what I call gnosis. Gnosis is when you have direct experience. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, perhaps in Eastern traditions, sometimes in specific ones, there would be a guru and they wouldn't even speak. They would just literally be like telepathing information to a person at a certain point. I was like, that'd be a nice gig.
Yeah.
That also has the potential to be like the emperor is not wearing any clothes, like that's ripe for,
Yep.
charlatans. But that mysticism to me is when the tricycle wheels have served their purpose. So that's knowledge. We need knowledge. I know spirituality has a mixed reception with knowledge. It's one that's revered, but then it's also one that it's like looked at as like just strictly information that will clutter the mind. Knowledge is different than information. So any type of spiritual structure will always start off with what I call the exoteric. That will be the outer ring of teachings. Those are the ones that we're most familiar with. Even in mysticism, that still applies. So there's these outer rings, and then you could call it an initiation. But in any spiritual system, so right now I'm speaking about mysticism, the deeper you go into that system is supposed to, the main difference with mysticism versus religion is with religion, it's more like there's a mediator And that's the end of the story. With mysticism, you go deeper and deeper into whatever spiritual system it might be in order for the tricycle wheels to eventually be able to come off. That's not a guarantee. That's not a promise, but that's the goal. And once those tricycle wheels are off, the being now can receive information from whatever they want to call it. They could call it their higher self. They could call it their higher power, whatever name they want to give it, God, source. But the goal is to be able to connect with their own direct experience. When we're in direct experience, we could get information now. And if we were told, oh, that symbol meant one thing, in direct experience, we could be told the symbol was that, and nobody might have told a person that. And it's because they're now like mission accomplished. Like they're now able to, they're coming from the unprogrammed being. They're more connected to their soul essence. And because they've developed their soul essence, now they're starting to get back to that telepathing. Now they're just telepathing things. And even if there's not a guru necessarily in front of them, they're being given direct experience. That's what gnosis is. So I operate now from gnosis, but my past was in mystery schools and teachings. And so because of that, I can act like a coherent bridge between logic, reason, and between intuition, or what we would just call mania.